The words of Paul to his friends in Rome from the 8th chapter of his letter. I reckon that the sufferings we now endure bear no comparison to the splendor as yet unrevealed, which is in store for us all. For even the created universe waits with eager expectation for God's children to be revealed. It was made the victim of frustration, not by its own choice, but because of him who made it so. Yet always there was hope, because the universe itself is to be freed from the shackles of mortality and enter upon the liberty and splendor of the children of God. Up to the present, we know the whole created universe groans in all its parts as if in the pangs of childbirth. And not only so, but even we, to whom the fruit of the Spirit has been given. For now we have been saved through hope. Now to see is no longer to hope. Why would a man endure and wait for what he already sees? But if we hope for something we do not see, then in waiting for it, we demonstrate our endurance. Let us bow together for a moment. In the turning of the seasons again, before the stir of activities and tasks which litter our calendars, grant us moments apart where we shall know refreshment and renewal, that we may find new strength and hope. In the Spirit of Jesus, Amen. She sits wringing her hands, dark lines under her eyes, has not been sleeping well, seems unable to get on with her life. She had thought they were headed for marriage, but after his last trip, he called to say it was all over, and now she doesn't know what to do, doesn't seem to have anything toward which to live. He chats with friends. They note silently that his own vigor is no longer there. The purchase of his company by a Japanese firm relieved him of his executive position. Severance arrangement was good. He could live quite well, and of course he was close to retirement anyway, but he seemed a little moody, vague, listless. The young man had just received his grades, and now it was clear that architecture was out of the picture, but that's all he ever wanted, and now nothing seems to matter very much. He knows his parents are disappointed. He's drinking too much, unable to concentrate, get down to work. She's moody. The last child just left, and yet she can't get excited about her newfound freedom. She really doesn't want a career, but is vaguely envious of those who have one. I think Judith Viorst caught her spirit. Why do I seem to remember Pearl Harbor? Surely I must be too young. When did the boys I once clung to start losing their hair? Why can't I take barefoot walks in the park without giving my kidneys a chill? There's poetry left in me still, and it doesn't seem fair. While I was thinking I was just a girl, my future turned into my past. The time for wild kisses goes fast, and it's time for Sanka already. What's the picture? The picture of people going through the inevitable losses that are part of life. Death of the dog, change of address, start of college, shift of career, friends leaving town. All losses which are part of the fabric of anyone's story, aren't they? And losses which generate inevitably a certain amount of depression and discouragement and even despair. Like the politician who lost the election overwhelmingly and said to his supporters, you know, I'm reminded of an epitaph I saw on an old tombstone. It read, I expected this, but not so soon. Which is why hope is so important. Because reversal, defeat, loss are an inevitable part of our lives, and it's the capacity to digest the blows, to grieve the losses, and to turn and look forward again, to believe in tomorrow, to hope again, because that's what saves us, for we have been saved through hope, writes Paul long ago. In an interview, the late Dr. Carl Menninger, one of the founders of the famed clinic in Topeka, Kansas, said, hope is a basic ingredient of any life. Still, not much has been said or written about it. St. Paul knew about it and placed it right up there with faith and love. But if you look in the Encyclopedia Britannica, you'll find pages about faith and you'll find columns about love, but Hope, poor little old Hope, she's not even mentioned at all. He talks about the importance of hope in teaching. If you ever hear a teacher say a student is hopeless, you've got a hopeless teacher on your hands. He talks about its role in medicine. I trust we're seeing the last of the hopeless doctors who tell their patients that their case is hopeless. Once I saw a feeble-minded child recover. Medically, her case was hopeless, but she recovered anyway. So hope had been there all along. We just didn't see it. He points out that laboratory experiments indicate that hope is the lifeline that makes survival possible. Rats and other animals in stressful situations survive as long as they can see some way out. But you close that off. You close off hope, and they very quickly give up and die. If you lose hope, Dr. Carl says, you stop trying, and you stop caring, and you're dead. So the old word is right. It is in hope that we are saved. So how do we get it and keep it? Well, clearly, I think we need to recognize that it begins with the embrace of faith. There's a sense in which hope and faith are simply two sides of the same coin. Who hopes for what he sees, asks the apostle. I really think here is where hope is a deeper and a more profound reality than mere optimism. I have nothing against optimism, but it seems to me that generally when we talk about optimism, we're talking about a selective way of seeing, aren't we? We're talking about looking at the glass as half full rather than half empty. Someone said they encountered the ultimate in an optimistic advertisement the other day. It said, "For sale, 1926 Stutz Bearcat. Take over the payments." So optimism, as we use the word, generally means the willingness to pay attention to the good in our lives, the promising in our seeing, and that's not bad. But hope, as the old faith speaks of it, is different. It's deeper, because it's hope in God. That is, hope is the confidence we have in that which we do not see. No matter what the picture happens to be at the moment, no matter whether the glass is half empty or bone dry, this does not predict or determine tomorrow. Tomorrow is ultimately in the hands of a reality that we cannot anticipate or predict, and whose purposes are ultimately loving and good. To hope in God is to believe that whatever tomorrow brings, God will be there, and therefore there will be something good in tomorrow. This is the faith expressed in a lot of the hymns, like James Russell Lowell's. It's in the book. Though the cause of evil prosper, yet his truth alone is strong. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadows, keeping watch over his own. The wise have been predicting the demise of the human story for centuries. The great Erasmus called his age, the 16th century, the excrement of the ages. Bossuet, French intellectual, in the thick of the 17th century, judged it a wicked and paltry age. Rousseau, in the 18th century, spoke of it as the great rottenness amidst which we live. Now we go to school and we learn about the 16th as the age of Reformation and Renaissance, the 17th as the age of discovery, including the New World, and the 18th as the age of revolution, including our own. The scientific historians, the pundits, the commentators we listen to on Channel 11, and who pretend to see, very seldom get it right. Toward the end of the 15th century, all Europe was caught up in the chill of despair and hopelessness. There was such dismay that people widely believed the world was coming to an end. In the year 1492, a German author and publisher produced a book called the Nuremberg Chronicle. And in it, he listed all the catastrophes that had ever happened to the human race and all of those that were impending on the scene. He even, in a climax of dejection, invited the reader to use the blank pages he left at the end to record any further catastrophes that he had overlooked. Of course, the very year the book was published and popular throughout Europe, there sailed into the harbor of Lisbon a battered little sailing ship that had returned through the storms of the Atlantic, and at the wheel there was a man whose story was too amazing to be true. He spoke not of the end of the world, but about a new world of endless possibilities. Whenever we claim to read the future from the appearance of the present, we rarely get it right, whether we are economists or politicians or preachers or just ordinary people. The great Henry Adams said in 1903, "My figures all coincide in fixing 1950 as the year when the world will end in ruin." Dr. Forbes Winslow said in 1910, by comparing the mental illness in 1809 with the mental illness in 1909, it's clear that an insane world is just over the horizon. President Jimmy Carter said in 1978, because of the greatness of the Shah, Iran will always be an island of stability in the Middle East. My favorite is the Business Week prophecy of 1979. With over 50 foreign cars already on the market here, the Japanese auto industry doesn't have a ghost of a chance of carving out any significant slice of the US market. I could go on. I got a whole drawer full of them at home, you know? Haven't we learned the lesson in the past 5 years? The futility of pretending to see. 5 years ago, when anybody asked me about the wall in Berlin and whether it would ever come down, I would confidently say, as an expert about the wall, never in my lifetime. Art Schlesinger Jr. wrote recently on the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal, if any pundit or commentator had predicted in 1985 that within 8 years Germany would be reunited, communism discredited, the Soviet Union dissolved, Eastern Europe liberated, Israel and the PLO recognizing one another, he would have been written off as mad. I remember the line of Winston Churchill. He said, "The future is not difficult to predict at all, especially when it's past." To paraphrase the psalm, the Lord brings the plans of the nations to nothing. A dictator is not saved by a great army, nor a warrior by great strength. A man cannot trust his armored personnel carrier to save him, but the Lord's eyes are toward those who fear him, toward those who hope. Hope is the conviction that something good is going on in history that we cannot see, that we cannot anticipate, that we cannot manipulate, but to which we may trust our very lives. And as in history, no less in our own story, the dismal circumstances of the moment, the sad turn of events of this day, the economic reversal we could not possibly anticipate, do not determine tomorrow, do not decide our lives. We too need to hope for what we do not see, precisely because we do not know. With the psalmist, we hope in God. This is precisely also what the old book means when it talks about hoping in Jesus and his story. His cross, you see, speaks of everything that human beings could see, the futility and despair of any kind of decent life in this world. His resurrection speaks of what could not be seen by the skeptical and cynical, a future that God was creating right through that cross and out beyond for the whole world. But this faith in the unseen does require some moves on our part. The hope, which is faith, requires a bit of fantasy, for one thing. To give hope form and staying power, we need to picture some possible tomorrows. We need to catch some vision of what it is we want to hope for, a vision real enough so that we can begin to touch it. One of my favorite cartoons is a picture of two prisoners shackled to the wall of a deep, dark dungeon. Spread-eagled, they're secured, lashed by manacles and chains, actually hanging suspended side by side a few feet above the damp dungeon floor. And there's only one small window. It's about 30 feet up. They're immobile, alone, pinned inexorably to the wall. And the one prisoner is turning to the other and saying, "Now listen carefully. Here's my plan." Somehow I like that guy. Harry Emerson Fosdick once wrote, "Great living always starts with pictures, held in one's imagination of what he would someday like to be or do." Florence Nightingale dreamed of nursing. Edison dreamed of being an inventor. All such characters escape the mere shove of circumstance, the tyranny of fact, by imagining a future so vividly that they're drawn toward it. Hold a picture of yourself long and steady enough in your mind's eye, and you'll move toward it. Picture yourself vividly as defeated, and it alone will make victory impossible. Picture yourself as winning, and that will contribute immeasurably to success. Do not picture yourself or your future as anything, and you will drift like a derelict. Thornton Wilder, the great playwright, said much the same thing. Hope is a projection of the imagination, but so is despair. Despair all too readily embraces the ills it foresees, whereas hope is an energy that arouses the mind to explore imaginatively every possibility. In response to hope, the imagination is aroused to picture every possible outcome, to try every door, to fit together even the most heterogeneous pieces in the puzzle. Sometimes after the solution has been found, one can't even trace how one got there. Journalist Neil Morgan tells the story of his father, who was a man of hope, Baptist preacher, part-time journalist, who died at the age of 111 months. He always had something going for himself, says Neil. No matter what, he always had something out there he dreamed about. In his early career, he was a conscience to his little community. He was always writing letters to the editor, calling for change toward what he dreamed for his small town. He was a constant visitor to sick and shut in because he didn't think they ought to be sick and shut in. At age 97, he mailed cheery postcards by the thousands to persons he knew needed a lift. They were all signed S.L. Morgan, 97 and a half. In his last 2 months before his 100th birthday, he could not write any longer, spoke only very little. But in his last years, he'd been sustained by one dream that was still there, of making it to 100. When the big day came, writes his son, the family gathered, and with us droves of friends, and we circled his bed, and I leaned close, and I shouted, "You are 100 years old today." He said in a hoarse whisper, "Say it again." And then he laughed, because he'd won his final fight. The way he'd won them all, with a deep faith in his God and in the future. At the funeral 11 months later, one old friend sought to explain what force sustained my father, writes Neil. He spoke of believing that no matter the scope of one's influence, one must live with hope and leave the rest to God. I realized as the casket disappeared that I was clutching my father's last letter to me. In it he had written, "I think it may be as good to be a reporter who preaches a little as a preacher who reports a little. But either way, we both met life head on, didn't we?" And haven't you known those, seriously, who were able to keep going in life because they hung on to some slim dream? And where is your dream this morning? Hope, which is faith in the unseen, needs support from our fantasies. And it needs a little support from our feet as well. Hope in God is sustained as we take the first step, as we act hopefully, as we make some moves toward the future which are positive. Hope is paradoxical, writes Erich Fromm. It is neither passive waiting nor is it unrealistic forcing of circumstances. It's more like a crouched tiger that will jump when the moment for jumping comes. Those whose hope is weak settle down for comfort or for violence. Those whose hope is strong are ready at any moment to help the birth of that which is ready to be born. And Louis Smedes out in California points out that we fear and hope at the same time. And the question for us is a little like an ordinary visit to the doctor, which is a parable of fear and hope struggling with one another. And fear says, "Don't go, you may get bad news." And hope says, "Well, go ahead. Maybe you'll get good news." There's a man who had a physical recently, and his physician said to him, "You're in great shape for a 60-year-old. "But Doc, I'm 47, he said. "I know," said the physician. While in Jerusalem recently, we visited Yad Vashem, the memorial to the Holocaust. And while we were there, I was reminded of an old story that emerged out of the darkness of the camps. I think it was Buchenwald. True story, though. There was a group of Jewish physicians in that camp who were also prisoners and who had to follow the same crushing routines that everybody else had to follow. They got up at 4 a.m., they stood and shivered through the roll calls. They worked a day-long drudgery on the Autobahn and finally received a cold bowl of thin soup at the end of the day. They were starved and beaten and overworked just like the other prisoners, with no reason to expect any other fate than the miserable deaths that they saw happening every day. But at night, when the other prisoners were asleep, these weary doctors would get up and huddle together in secret as a group and talk. They discussed cases together, they prepared and presented papers to each other, they made plans for improving the health conditions in a camp, that seemed futility itself. Then they got the idea of trying to build an X-ray machine, and they began to smuggle in materials. They had to bribe some guards. They had to steal some things, concealing them in their clothes, and slowly, with the help of other prisoners who were engineers and electricians that they called together, they were able to put together a primitive X-ray machine, and then they met secretly every night in their effort to diagnose and treat their fellow prisoners in an absolutely hopeless situation. How crazy, how futile. Oh no, by giving feet to their faith, their fantasies of a future, they kept not only a lot of the rest of the prisoners alive, but they literally kept themselves alive until that camp was liberated. And I leave it to you to translate that story into this day and your own life. In any event, the old word says, "For in hope we are saved." Now, to see is no longer to hope. But if we hope for something we do not yet see, then in waiting for it, we show our endurance and we are saved. Indeed.